teaching in South Africa for the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, Jewish Board of Deputies of South Africa, and Limud, South Africa. He's thrilled to be invited back to the Everett Jewish Center and is joined this week by his wife, Dr. Catherine Windmueller. He has for sale his book, Donald Trump, American Jewry and Israel, for sale. It will be available in the front at the desk there after his presentation. Let me see here. Yep, I think that's everything. Please welcome Dr. Windmueller.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Everett House, to a very quiet, calm political environment. There is nothing happening under the sun. And indeed, in even thinking about today's program, who could have imagined the events just over the past several days? We're 113 days away from the 60th presidential election. It is a unique election in so many ways. It will mark the last occasion by which Americans will have the opportunity to vote for two political figures who are really part of the legacy of the Second World War, as both Donald Trump and Joe Biden frame that period. It will be an extraordinary election in so many other ways, as we well know. And with the announcement earlier today of the vice presidential selection by the Republican Party of Senator J.D. Vance, it is very clear that we have an election with ideological divides and a momentum in terms of two very defining and distinctive political perspectives. So let us begin our journey this afternoon. In so many ways, one cannot talk about 2024 without reflecting on the whole scope of the Jewish presence in North America and in the United States in particular. It is indeed an understanding of the fact that American Jews have been here from the outset, which is not the story of diaspora Jewry. In so many other instances, Jews would come to a society, help build it, and participate within it. But the American story is quite different. It is distinctive by the fact that we have these deep political, social, religious roots within the American scenario. It is also important to realize that we have been major contributors to the political ideas and cultural thinking of this society throughout these 250 years. It is important to note as well that our story has become part of the American Jewish story. The Jewish contract with America in so many different ways describes and defines the particular and unique characteristics of Jewish engagement. George Washington's letter to the Jews of Newport in so many ways frames that contract. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. And the notion of security has been profoundly important to the American Jewish experience, and the sense that anti-Semitism in this society was never state-sponsored, with one exception. Ulysses S. Grant's Order Number 11 in 1862 would mark the only time by which a federal agency or governmental institution or leader would invoke the distinctiveness of such a resolution to remove Jews from the southern tier of the United States. But that moment would be offset immediately by Lincoln's decision to have that order rescinded. And ultimately, throughout the history of American presidents, the extraordinary relationship that the Jewish community would have with each succeeding administration, whether dealing with situations in Europe, the Middle East, or elsewhere, were clearly defined by this distinct contractual arrangement that Jews enjoyed in the United States and continue to do so. And indeed, precisely because of the extraordinary involvement of Jews within the United States, we have elected over the course of our history since 1851, 38 Jews have won seats in the United States Senate and 215 in the House of Representatives. Indeed, beginning in the 1850s, this explosion of Jewish connection to the political system would be profound on the state and local levels as well, as literally hundreds of city council persons, mayors, judges, and other officials would become part of the American political establishment. In the current Congress, the 118th, we retain that same degree of political engagement with 27 members of the House and 10 United States senators. So what do we know about Jewish voters? We know a good deal. Some of it is more comical and reflective, but much of it is serious and important. Indeed, as one commentator had suggested, Jews are more pro-choice than pro-Israel. And Jewish exceptionalism, this notion that Jews were somehow distinctive in their American story and their American journey, was reflected as well by the commentary of Milton Himmelfarb in the 1960s, when Milton suggested Jews live like Episcopalians, but they vote like Puerto Ricans, suggesting this notion of the liberal frame in which many Jews would find themselves that would define and shape much of their political history, but that would be a history of the 20th century, as we shall see. And indeed, there is so much that would bear on this notion. As we enter this election, we remind ourselves that Jews are concentrated in principally 8 states, and that 75% of us are part of that 188 electoral college votes that comprise those 8 states. And yet it is the Bagel Belt, which includes Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, and I would add several other states, have now entered into the sort of leaning toward or becoming either purple or in contention for their votes. And those states, interestingly enough, now include New Hampshire, Minnesota, as well as New York, where the lead of the Democrats here in New York has dwindled to under 10%. I think it's important that we go back into some historic context to look at how the elections have shaped and how the Jewish community has been responsive to those elections. We begin here in 1948, but I think we step back for a few moments to remind ourselves that Jews were principally Republican between 1864 and 1912. And we have to understand what that was. That was the Lincoln effect. Abraham Lincoln dies on Passover, 1864. And if you look back at the sermons delivered in synagogues at that moment and reflect on the connections between the Jewish community and Lincoln's ideas and his practices and policies, one sees this profound and very personal connection of Lincoln and his influence on the Republican Party and on Jewish voters throughout the second half of the 19th century. When we come to the 20th century, we have an explosion of ideas emerging. We have Jews arriving here from 1880 to 1920 from Eastern Europe who come with socialist, communist, anarchist ideas and bring those ideas into the American political frame. So that in the elections between 1912 and 1924, we see extraordinary introduction of third-party candidates, such as Eugene V. Debs and his socialist model drawing huge numbers of Jewish support. Or the ideas of Senator La Follette, who also brings a kind of progressive agenda that brings to him significant numbers of Jewish voters. When we come to the post-Second World War period, we see in Henry Wallace an interesting candidate in that election, where Wallace draws 15% of the Jewish vote, and he gets nationally 2%. But the Jewish community, responsive to his progressive and socialist ideas, moves to this third-party position. So, in coming to 1980, many political scientists are interested in the 1980 and 1984 elections, and we want to take a look at those for a moment because we have three candidates in 1980, and the Jewish community again moves, interestingly enough, away from Jimmy Carter toward Ronald Reagan, but also gives significant support to John Anderson of Illinois, who is the third party selection. But what political scientists ask is, why did Jewish support drop for Reagan in 84? And we believe the moral majority has an impact here. The rise of the moral majority as a political force scares Jews in terms of the separation of church and state questions, raises other issues about sort of expectations about what that will do to sort of Christianizing America. And so that introduces a whole new frame of concern, which changes the balance, in a sense, of the political outcomes in 1984. So when we come to the rise of Donald Trump and his presence in the political scenarios, we come to 2016 and the election involving Hillary Clinton. And again, of course, in 2020. Now, we have a number of polling resources from both of those elections. So these are sort of summaries of various outcomes, because we have distinctive voting patterns, for example, in Florida, where Trump does better among certain Jewish voters. And we have very clear data of Orthodox Jews who are overwhelmingly supportive of Donald Trump, and that number has actually increased between 2016 and 2020, and our projections are for 2024 it will likely also accelerate. We have a study out of Pennsylvania, for example, in the 2020 election, where the support for Joe Biden is actually more than the 68% as reflected here, but is well over 74%. But the election in this coming year is more than simply about the White House, as we know. It reflects a great deal about the general patterns of what we are seeing in the United States in terms of shifts and changes, and the fact that we have, as we all know historically, a third of the Senate is required to be reelected in these cycles of every 6 years. And therefore, we have a number of open races and a number of contested races on the Senate side. I would point out to you that we believe that about 1.8 million American Jews, or that's just about a third of all eligible Jewish voters, live in 25 congressional districts. And those districts are basically in 7 states: Florida, California, Illinois, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. But there are 2 districts which are profoundly or overtly Jewish. Florida's 21st congressional district, which is Hollywood, Florida, and areas around it, has 152,000 Jewish voters. And the 17th congressional district, which is Westchester and the areas above Westchester County, Rockland County, which is the 17th district of New York in the lower Hudson Valley, and that too has a significantly large number of Jewish voters, mostly Orthodox. These 2 are the largest constituencies where we have the single highest sort of percentile of Jewish voters across the United States. What we also need to take a look at is some of the history of both how did we become politically conservative, how did we become politically liberal, and what are the other political ideologies that define and shape the American Jewish experience today. And no doubt, as we talk about these different categories, we remind ourselves in particular of the work of historian Jonathan Sarna in describing where and how this political conservatism arose and developed within the American context. The idea of limited government, the notions of support for particular values, religious values in particular, national security and defense, advocates specifically for the security of the State of Israel, and certainly for American political security. And no doubt, these particular ideas have shaped different kinds of voters that today define the Republican Jewish context of how Jews vote as Republicans. The most clearly defined category are what we would call identity Jewish voters. Identity political voters are those who come to the polls, who come to their political positions out of a belief that self-interests of their community, of their interests, ought to be defined, preserved, and advanced. And as a result, identity voters are profoundly important inside the Republican Jewish context. The second group are religious values voters. So those would be Orthodox voters. They are principally concerned about the celebration of religion and state. They have fewer problems with this wall of separation, and also believe a society is stronger, healthier, and more engaged if religion is a profound part of the social mix. And then, of course, you have never Trump Republicans, those Republicans who remain deeply committed, whether as neoconservatives or as even identity voters, but precisely because of their interests in the fact that they don't perceive Donald Trump to be in the image of the Republican historic conservative model. So you have a variety of different streams of Republican voters, and that will be reflected again this year as the divides and contours of how Republican Jews see themselves and their votes. Certainly, American liberalism is also a deeply embedded notion, and here we return to such writers as Leonard Fine and a host of others who have addressed over the years the question of why are Jews liberal, what does that liberalism consist of? And what some historians are suggesting is that liberalism is like a moving target. It is different kinds of liberal expressions depending on the particular times in which we live, the particular issues of a campaign, or the particular concerns of a community. So that liberalism is not static, but in their minds, or in the minds of these historians, it's a movable idea shaped to the particular moment. So we have social justice Democrats who come to this either because of their religious imperative of tikkun olam, of sort of repairing the world, or from some other advocacy perspective that may grow outside of the Jewish community, but aligns as well with their Jewish sense of identity and engagement. We still have other voters in the Democratic support group that we would describe as suburban Democrats. Their voice is that they tend to take on the features of other suburbanites, reflecting concerns about abortion or the right of a woman for a choice that she should be able to make. And there are other issues that are distinctively framed by their considerations based on the communities in which they live, the framework of friendships they have, and the kinds of social connections that they have developed. The urban independent voter is actually the most interesting. It is the fastest growing part of what we are looking at among younger Jewish voters. Younger Jewish voters tend not to be party affiliated. And that's true, by the way, for non-Jewish Gen Zs and millennials who tend to register as independents, so that the fastest growing part of the American electorate, including young Jewish voters, are to describe themselves as independent. 27% of young American Jews have so registered for this election as independents. What we also see are what we call the red diaper babies. These are the progressives, or the children or grandchildren of the progressives that we spoke about earlier, the socialists, the anti-war factions during Vietnam, and their grandchildren, continuing this kind of progressive voice of being on the edges of American politics, and in some measure being caught in this dilemma between the progressives who are sitting in the Congress, whose opposition to Israel, for example, is problematic for them, but who align with them on many of the other ideological and political issues of concern to domestic society. We account for about 8% of American Jews who would be identified as probably politically progressive in this context. So we have a number of particular and unique features to this election. And those include, on the Republican side, the extraordinary rise of what we're calling national conservatism. That is not Ronald Reagan's conservative ideology. It is an ideology that we see in Hungary, that we have seen now evolving in Austria, that we see to some degree even in Russia. We see to a lesser degree even in Israel in terms of the right wing of the Israeli political establishment. And we see it in the contours of what is happening in France with the far right, and what we have seen in Germany and elsewhere with the rise of extraordinarily strong national conservative right-of-center political movements. The second factor that accompanies part of what will define and shape the Trump momentum as this campaign moves forward will be Christian nationalism. And this, too, is a phenomenon that has become increasingly broadened and more sophisticated over time and become a uniquely American phenomenon. The Christianity and Americanism are seen as sort of coming together as one, that this is a Christian nation that ought to sort of celebrate and promote its Christianity in the context of its national identity and democracy. And we see that playing out in the various ways in terms of introduction of the Ten Commandments in Louisiana's school district. We see it in the context of other legislation that is now pending in many of the red states associated with the ideas of bringing Christianity into the body of American politics. And the third, of course, is the Trump phenomenon of populism. Trump is not the inventor of this, but he is certainly one that has understood how to create the kind of populist attention and definitions to how to grow and expand his sort of brand, his presence as part of the Republican expression. I would then point to the reality that we have these two sort of ideological camps that have evolved, where democratic liberalism focuses on separation, for example, of church and state, and where we see a kind of multilateralism and globalism that still remains central to much of what the Biden democratic model will look like. And that, of course, contrasts to the very nationalistic orientation that we're seeing and the isolationist ideologies that we have seen with Donald Trump's emergence. We have a third set of ideas as well, and these are coming from the far left, and they project a kind of postmodernist rejection of much of what America has been and what it needs to become. In their argument, America has been a white colonialist empire, and they want to create the notions that other races and other cultures have got to be sort of brought into the spectrum of American political behavior. For them, intersectionality is the notion that minorities are collectively seen as without power, marginalized, and limited. Their argument is to suggest that critical race theory employs the notion that the majority of Americans have racial beliefs, negative racial ideas about the idea of equality and engagement and power sharing. The problem here for American Jews becomes much more relevant and clear. Because if we think on the far left, we are seeing a problem of anti-Semitism and directed hate against Israel, then we will also need to take a look at what's happening on the far right. And on the far right, with a whole assortment of groups, including the Proud Boys, we begin to see a notion of "you will not replace us." So what was said in Charlottesville in 2017 was precisely those words: Jews will not replace us. Replacement theory suggests that there is a concerted effort by American Jews and the Jewish establishment to replace the white Anglo-Saxon power structure, not necessarily with Jews, but with Jewish allies in a concerted effort to claim power. So on the far left, the notion of whiteness is that Jews have lost their minority status because they have become too white. On the far right, the notion is that Jews are seeking to become part of the establishment and claiming whiteness. So we have this extraordinary ideological war in which we are caught in the middle by the extremes in American society, which is a new phenomenon in terms of both how we understand anti-Semitism and why the American Jewish Committee study, which was released last week, suggests that 85 to 90% of American Jews are deeply concerned about the threat, the rise, and the presence of anti-Semitism within this society. For all of this that we've just described, it is important to understand that the issues of race, the subject of immigration, and the question of nationalism are the profound basis upon which much of this political contest will be based. And for Jews, this becomes precisely the element, the point of grave concern. Our concerns here are certainly from both the extremes that we've just described. And if you've never taken a look at the Turner Diaries or examined the Camp of the Saints, these are the ideological pinpoints of the far right in this country. And the threat of immigration, the fear of Jews, the power of the minority world sort of capturing and remaking America from being a white Christian society into something other than that. And on the far left, the ideas of Alinsky and Chomsky and others in terms of how power itself is corruptive and corrosive, and that how the power establishment has denied other groups their place. And part of that conversation has led to obviously an attack on Israel as being a kind of the epitome of the American experience of America creating an Israel or supporting an Israel that is apartheid, colonialist, Zionist, and ultimately needs to be destroyed. So that becomes the sort of body of the language and ideology that we've just been talking about. I mean, I think for American Jewish voters this fall, there will be many issues. And certainly their politics are going to be tied to what they have experienced and what they are seeing in terms of the right of Israel to defend and secure itself as a national Jewish state, but also to deal with the realities of their kids and grandkids in terms of what is happening on our campuses and schools. It will also be about the rise and continued growth of American Jewish orthodoxy and its place within the American Jewish storyline. And indeed, we will see a number of new voters. We will have 8 million Americans who will be for the first time casting ballots. And by the way, the 2020 election produced the single largest turnout since we've seen in American presidential campaigns since 1900, as 66% of Americans voted in 2020. But we don't believe that number will be repeated or come close to that outcome, sadly, in 2024. We think as many as 10% of American voters are not turned on to this conversation, are in fact dissipated and are dispatching their engagement with politics, feeling bereft and overwhelmed, even angry, and feeling unrepresented by the candidates and the conduct of this campaign. We will also have to identify the fact that we are looking at a deep divide, not only in this country, but within the Jewish community, divide over Israel, where many of our younger members of our community are feeling quite detached from the Israel experience since October 7th, and where other American Jews are feeling disconnected with other Jews around a variety of these political issues, the deep divides over the candidates, and certainly the concerns about how best to treat and manage anti-Semitism. And no doubt, much of this campaign and much of the conversation is about social media and the impact of social media, its effects on both promoting and nurturing and unfortunately creating these untruths and misrepresentations, not just of Jews, but of much of the conversation about politics, and thereby creating a problem in terms of how one manages and deals with the balance of free expression versus the notions of providing truthful, accurate, and responsible responses to facts and storylines. And I think what we are also experiencing in this election, or will experience, is an extraordinary concern of a sense of feeling isolated, feeling a sense of loneliness, feeling a sense of fear. American voters in general, but Jewish voters in particular, are responding to this sense of feeling quite concerned about sort of the state or the uncertainty of the state of American stability and civility, and the effects of that on creating a country moving forward that is whole and unified. We are the oldest white, ethnic, religious community in the United States. And to point to some examples of that, in Florida, for example, 42% of Florida's Jewish voters are 65 years of age and over, compared to the statewide population where only 26% are 65. In Arizona, 35% of the Jewish voters who are 65 will be voting, whereas the whole overall statewide, it's 23%. And in California, it's a 30% to 19% discrepancy. So we see significant realities that Jews are an older voting constituency. We account nationally for about 1.8% of the American public, of the 330 million Americans. In reality, though, in some states, especially states which will be very close in this election, the likelihood is that Jewish vote may be important and significant. For example, in a state such as Arizona, which has 1.2% of the voting populace, it could be very significant. So we point to the fact that we now need to look, because of the Electoral College, state by state in terms of where Jews may constitute an important voting group and have an impact on outcomes in some of those particular elections. Historian Gil Troy of McGill University suggests that American Jews are giving up to 1/2 of all dollars raised to the Democratic Party. And he argues that 1/4, that is 1 out of every $4, to the Republican National Committee. Whether he's correct or not, the larger issue here is the significant role that Jews play in the political process. As voters, for sure, because we voted 85%, which is the highest percentage of any ethnic, racial, or religious community in North America. But it is also in the context of being journalists, commentators, elected officials, and of course as donors to causes and campaigns. We have 88 public or political PACs. And these PACs support particular candidates or a particular party or a particular cause, whether it has to do with Israel or environment or any number of other issues. So these political action committees, along with all of the other dollars being generated, will generate a campaign this year that will cost the American citizenry $14 billion, which is going to be what the outcome will be of the 2024 election, the most expensive political election in American history. Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, for example, as a counterpoint, was $2 billion. This will be $14 billion when all is added up in terms of the costs of ads and all of the consultants hired and all of the materials invested and developed and all of the conventions and their expenses. So it is important to remind ourselves how politically expensive all of this represents. No doubt, this is going to be an election where different parties and different sides reflect on different aspects of what is before us, whether it's going to be about abortions or immigration, whether it'll be about our borders, whether it'll be about rebuilding the economy, whether it'll be about certainly the public square and the issues of hate, whether against Jews or others, and certainly gun safety. And no doubt, for many voters, foreign policy and security remain a priority. Now, the data on this chart is from November 2023, but the Jewish Electoral Institute has just published last week a new study. The data here does not give Biden quite that number of 68%. This is a projection of what the Jewish vote may look like. They are suggesting somewhere closer to 60-61%, but are indicating that the third-party candidates, so Robert Kennedy, Gail Stein, Chase Oliver from the Libertarian Party, will draw off some voters. So the national projections here are somewhere between 10 and 15% of American voters, of which we can include here a significant part of the Jewish community, will be voting third party almost as a statement of their disconnect from the two major political campaigns and representatives. But what's also important is the principle here that we will see an increase most likely in Donald Trump's support. And here we will see as well an economist study from March of this year that suggests that Trump will do better than this projection, which has 22%, and the latest projections that both the Electoral Institute has and other studies suggest, which is around 27%. They're suggesting that Trump will score almost 37% with Jewish voters, which I think is high, and as a commentary, I don't necessarily think that's an accurate read. But what are the issues that Jews vote upon? Now, we don't have the data on Israel, which I think is very high, and I would suggest that the poll that the Electoral Institute has now will project that, and I don't have those outcomes. And the data they had in November of 2023 when they did their study of American Jewish voters suggested only a small percentage. But I think that has changed radically since the 7th of October and the events that have so followed. So political scientists often ask me, why would healthcare and Social Security rank so high among Jewish voters? And I would remind them that we're an older voting bloc, and that Americans in general, and Jewish voters in this case in particular, constitute or think about such issues as healthcare, Social Security as important. And they also ask the question about the Supreme Court. How could that even be on the list? You don't vote for the Supreme Court. And I said, no, it's not that. It's the ideology. It's the culture of the society is framed by the courts. The courts, especially the Supreme Court, frames the very notions about the belief systems and the sort of benchmarks by which and how the society will be governed and managed. And that is precisely why for American voters, the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, is ranked as such a significant item. I think for many American Jews, in light of the events over these 9 months, the issues of Gaza, the impact of anti-Semitism will be driving considerations as they make their choices, and which party, which candidate will best reflect the protections that they are looking for. The American Jewish Committee study of last week suggests that overwhelmingly American Jews view these two themes as critically core to their political concerns. The issue of political distrust on here is important because trust is a profoundly important issue in politics. People don't trust government or don't trust their leaders. This is really challenging. And since the period of 1970, that's 50 years, we've been looking at the decline of trust in America. Now, for Jewish voters, we retain an extraordinarily high degree of patriotism and enthusiasm and belief and hope for the American story because we're so deeply connected to it and believe in it and vote in its context, in its process. But for Americans as a whole, this is challenging. And this is also the threat where anti-Semitism comes front and center. When people no longer believe their leaders in saying that being supportive of minorities and embracing the idea of we're all in this together, then it becomes profoundly important for the society to figure out ways to rebuild trust in the institutions of governance and of its leadership. And that may be ultimately the test here of what the 2024 election will show, whether people have continued to lose trust or whether they believe in the system and the society. And for some Jews, political homelessness is a very real issue. The sense they are no longer sure that the Democratic Party will be there for them. They're uncertain of what will happen in Chicago when there will be demonstrations against the platform in support, or efforts to create a platform in support of Israel, and what that will look like. They are uncertain about the voices within the party who may ultimately grow in importance that could be more challenging to Jewish interests and to Jewish support. And on the far right, the concerns of Jews as well with regard to the rise of a kind of political voice of Christian nationalism and of the Proud Boys and others that reflect a kind of disconnect with what we or they perceive as the American story. All of this comes down to who will vote. And also it will reflect as well the questions of the changing voter constituencies. The fastest growing group of American voters are Asian Americans. And the most important groups are increasingly going to be Latin American voters, whose numbers are significant at this moment in terms of many key states. And what is also clear is that we are concerned about violence. We saw, sadly enough, violence over this past weekend, but we may well encounter more of such reactions both during the campaign and after it, should the results not satisfy certain constituencies. So American democracy is on this ballot. And our future, in so many ways, as American Jews, as American citizens, is dependent on a rich, fair, and vibrant election. Thank you. So we have a microphone here on the left side of this podium for those who would like to pose questions. I would ask if you have a speech to make it privately to me, but if you have a question, you can provide that.
Hello, my name is Kim Roden. Thank you very much for your thoughtful presentation. Data was very helpful. If you believe what I do, which is that the two candidates are being held to different standards, one being able to basically break the law, and the other one certainly we know has some issues as well. Do you believe there's a double standard when you look at these two candidates that are on the ballot, the major party candidates? And if so, why? Thank you.
The question of how candidates are treated is in the eye of the beholder, or how one experiences it. And certainly your perspective certainly is very much one that many Americans share. And I think this is part of the difficulty media has in trying to create a kind of neutral space for trying to articulate the complexities of this particular election and the emotional elements in connection with the two candidates, their records, their personal histories, and their performance. I think that what is failing us is really the media's inability to sort of step away and not be a commentary on what is happening, and allow us the space to define or determine this is what we believe, this is who we either accept or reject.
Anti-Semitism is clearly more visible on both the far left and the far right. How much do you fear that that's going to creep into the middle?
How much will anti-Semitism creep into the middle? I think it already is. And I think that part of that is that where once political elites, business elites, educational elites, and religious voices could frame statements about appropriate conduct, about Americanism, whatever that might be defined, that has lost its cachet, its authority, meaning where social media has replaced the role of elected officials, the power and authority of a university educator, or the importance of a moral voice of American religious leadership. And with that collapse, as we spoke about the distrust or loss of trust, that contributes and will continue to contribute to the rise of where we see in the middle increasing voices who will be free to articulate ugly and misrepresentative ideas, whether about Jews or others. So sadly, I have to concur that I really am concerned about the collapse of that extraordinary infrastructure that defined and sort of sustained us. Robert Putnam's notion of sort of, the notion of our bowling alone and the need to rebuild the social capital of our society is, as shared actually this morning by the scholar in residence here at Chautauqua. So I sense that this is going to grow as a challenge for the American Jewish community.
Do you have anything to say about the age of the candidates and their effect on the voters?
Well, I'm older than both of them, but my sense is that we have, in a sense, allowed our political structures to, in a sense, give way to sort of the voices of particular powerful interests or powerful influencers, and therefore, as a result, have lost the ability for what the party system used to allow, which was for more collective decision-making on who shall lead us and how we should sort of manage the political state of our country. So I think that sadly this is an outgrowth of part of the sort of collapse of the political parties as much more of a voice of leadership than a voice of simply followership, as in the case of both parties in some measure.
Do Jewish voters in Ohio not matter anymore?
Sorry to tell you, Ohio is pretty much a red state. Interestingly enough, of course, the abortion vote in Ohio, which really sort of showed this counterpoint, has had some profound effect in Kansas, as it did in Ohio. But in terms of elections, it's much more difficult for there to be a more in-play candidate in Ohio than we anticipated. We actually saw Ohio as one of those states that would be called purple, but it has sort of shifted over the last 8 to 12 years to be much more of a red state from what I can project, and therefore the Jewish vote, fairly small, can likely not to be particularly influential in 2024. Sorry.
I thought that last question was spectacular. I don't have a question, just a comment. Thank you very much for your talk. And I'd like to remind our guests that there's a book signing in the lobby immediately following this talk. So if you'll please let our speaker get to the table, that would be great. Thank you.